Very good morning to everyone and welcome to the second session of the Global Finance Conclave 2021. In this session, we have with us distinguished speaker, Dr. Amar Patnaik, Member of Parliament, Rajya Sabha. I will not take too much time. I'll just ask Dr. Ashish Bharadwaj, Dean of JSBF, to please begin the session by introducing and welcoming Dr. Patnaik.
Thank you very much, Amlan. Welcome everyone to the second session or the first keynote of the Global Finance Conclave 2021. We have this keynote address which is very strategically placed, continuing from where we left in the previous session. This address will contextualize the next several sessions of this conference, including the one immediately after this on Indian labor market. It's my pleasure to have Dr. Amar Patnaik deliver this keynote address on inequities and growth in India. Dr. Patnaik is, of course, a member of Parliament, Rajya Sabha from Odisha. He's a former career bureaucrat and he represents the Biju Janata Dal party. With a PhD in institutional economics, he's a member of the very crucial Joint Parliamentary Committee on Personal Data Protection. A lot of us in the university are following the proceedings, discussions of this committee. He's also a part of the Finance Committee. His writings are on a fascinating range of very contemporary issues. Some of the recent ones that I have personally read and my colleagues have read are on blockchain, cryptocurrencies, data protection, and even around climate change and international trade. He was recently in Geneva doing very important conversations and meetings with thinkers and representatives in Brussels, in Geneva, discussing all kinds of issues around sustainability, climate change, international trade, and so on. So with that, without any delay, I invite Dr. Amar Patnaik to deliver his keynote address. Over to you, sir.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bharadwaj, and thank you, Amlan. Thank you to the Vice Chancellor. Thank you to the entire team who is managing this conclave at the JGU. It's a pleasure to be here, pleasure to be speaking to the students and those who are interested in finance and things beyond finance as well. When this topic was initially brought to, when we discussed on finalizing this topic, I thought I would speak directly on finance, which is what I have been doing as a career bureaucrat in the CAG's organization for about 28 years before I quit and from the joint politics. And as I was just sharing with Dr. Bharadwaj, I thought I'll use the PowerPoint presentations, which one is used to as a bureaucrat or as a professor, than be unguided, which I'm learning to be as a politician. So I'll get into the deliberations straight away. And I'm mindful of the fact that there are 40 minutes for covering a wide range of things. I have also, written extensively in my book, Institutional Change and Power Asymmetry, on some of these topics. So the details of some of those deliberations that I touch upon today could actually be found in that book, which has a lot of research and identifies a number of variables across disciplines and not just from economics, as we know, it's beyond institutions. When one is talking about the asymmetric effects of growth in India, 1991-2021, I think it requires no brainer as to why 1991 has been chosen as the inflection point in Indian economy. And so I'll start with that what was India before 1991? Just know about it. I'll quickly go through them. It was heavily regulated, it was protected, it was nationalized. Next slide, please. Nationalized, had slowdowns in the industry, faced a severe deficit in its balance of payments, only had enough for about 2 weeks imports. Faced inflation up to 17%. GDP growth rate was one of the lowest at that point of time, below 1%. Unequal societal conditions, poverty, access to health and education was severely asymmetric even at that point of time. No money for government investments in physical and social infrastructure. Government investments itself were not available. No incentive there was there for private investment because of the heavy regulations and laws and protectionism that one followed. Next slide, please. Then came 91, and broadly I have categorized it as liberalization, privatization, and globalization. And this LPG model, as one loves to call it, and in no way connected to the LPG gas hike that one is talking about in the current political sphere as much. But it is something that fueled growth of India's economy and improved its social context to a great extent. The size of the cake kept on increasing. And when I say size of the cake kept increasing, it's basically I'm referring to the gross domestic product, which is the GDP. The per capita increased through, the PPP improved substantially, consumption increased, rise of consumerism, people started spending more, millions were pulled out of poverty, impetus to private investment, more elbow room for governments because private investment came in. Therefore, governments could actually spend money on health, on education, on access to primary services, similar such thing. But this success in controlling India's public accounts, debt, and the currency also happened, as I said in the previous slide, that we just had 2 weeks, we could be 2 weeks imports. That's position substantially improved in just about 4 years' time. The current account deficit was 3.3% of total GDP in 91, and in just about 4 years, it was less than 1%. India's trade and current account has grown significantly since 1991. Current account is a relative surplus standing at 6.5 billion now. The country has come out of the balance of payment crisis. In fact, we have one of the highest levels of forex reserves that independent India has ever seen. However, the trade deficit has soared to a 14-year high of $22.6 billion. We'll be discussing about this in subsequent slides. Next slide, please. So this is the GDP, how it grew in between 1960 and 2020. Just wanted to give you a flavor, not really going to dwell deep into it, but you can see how after the 1991, the GDP has behaved. There, of course, have been dips due to the global crisis, 2008, and then before that, initial part of 2000. Then, of course, the massive drop that is because of the pandemic. Next slide, please. But despite this entire growth, despite the size of the cake increasing, despite we achieving a GDP of about $2.7 trillion and aspiring to have $5 trillion by 2025, and if not 2025, maybe a few years later, but the economic liberalization, the LPG model has led to certain deficiencies, and these continue to rise in some cases. These asymmetric effects that were spurred due to LPG in 1991 has given rise to a number of inequities that we witness in 2021. It's not just a matter of declining growth rate and consumption, as we see over a period of last 7 to 8 years, but even declining private investment, and therefore declining private investment in basic services like health and education as well. Social sectors, health and education, they have been starved of both government and private investment commensurate with the increase in population. That is, the increase in population has taken place, and the growth in these areas of social infrastructure has not kept pace. Next slide. There have been rising deficits. The biggest concern to my mind, which we keep discussing in the Parliament, in the Standing Committee on Finance, is the growing public debt of both centre and the states. And this has been exacerbated by the current pandemic. 90% currently of the GDP is debt, central government debt, and it has been forecast that this will increase to, hovering around 85.2% of GDP by 2026. Mind you, we have something called as the FRBM Act, Fiscal Responsibility and Budget Management Act, that puts the debt stock, the ideal debt stock, to be somewhere around 25% of the GDP, which basically means that we are way above it. Some people may argue that this is necessary for a growing economy to meet the credit gap, and some may say that this is becoming disproportionately creating disproportionate amount of intergenerational inequity, about which I'll be talking later. It certainly doesn't help when exchange rate also continues to fall. Job creation and employment growth also not commensurate. Reforms in agriculture, manufacturing sector, and education has not happened the way we had envisaged in 1991. And all these has resulted in asymmetries and inequities. Asymmetries is a continuing process. Inequities at points of time have actually, if you plot it on a graph, it has actually increased. Not just economic inequity, it is opportunities inequity, it is social inequity, it is inequity in skill levels, inequity in the labor market, several such inequities. I have dealt about some of these in my book. Here I will be just speaking about a few of these crucial inequities that is probably going to create a problem for the society as a whole, because I think social stability is dependent on how we handle these inequities, and for that the asymmetric growth in various areas have to be addressed. Next slide, please. Yeah, so this is the graphical representation of what I mentioned. We can go to the next slide. A key area that has been hurt by this LPG model has been the distribution of income and wealth. Before 1991, India's per capita income stood at rupees 6,270, and in 2021, it stands at about 1 lakh at constant price. Very good. But the income inequality was initially declining between 1961 and 1991. That has now risen after 1991. This is a shocking admission of fact that while we have increased the size of the cake, the distribution, the trickle down has not happened the way probably we wanted, and that's what we talk about inclusive growth. In 1991, the top 1% possessed 10.4% of total income. And in the middle 40% had 44.9%. And 2019, without taking into consideration the effect of the pandemic and unemployment, the top 1% now controls 21.7%, and the middle 50%, middle 40% control only 29.7%. This will be very stark when I bring you the graphs in the next slide. The top 10%, now this is, I was talking about top 1%, now I'm talking about the top 10%. The top 10% has also had its control of income from 34.1%, it has increased to 56.1%, and the bottom 50%, which are the poorest, had the sharpest fall, a drop from 22.2% to 14.7% in this time frame. So you can see that the gap between the rich and the poor, the slabs who control, whose income levels have increased between 1991, 2020, 21, you see the gap is increasing. And the gap has increased substantially now to create a very high level of what we call as Gini coefficient. As far as wealth, this was the income that I was talking about. Now, if I talk about wealth, the possession of wealth by the top 1% only rose from 11.9% in 1961 to 16.1% before the absolute liberalization took place. But from 1991, when the liberalization took place, the same 1% owned 42% of the wealth in 2020. On the other hand, the proportion of wealth of the bottom 50% fell from 12.3% in 61 to 2.8% in 2020. Can I have the next slide, please? So you can see in these bar charts that the gap between the gray color bars are 1991 positions and the green color shoots are 2019. You can see that the gap between the percentage of share between the bottom has decreased. You look at the position on the first portion of the graph and the last bars, you can see that this income inequality has actually widened substantially. Next, we go to the next charts give me about wealth inequality. You can see a similar position here. In fact, it is probably much more starker here. Next slide, please. Now, if you look at the consumption, the purchasing power of the Indians, it has rose drastically from the end of the 20th century as a result of the LPG. The objective became more geared towards economic participation and consumption. In 1991, per capita PPP stood at $1,173. By 2019, it had become approximately 7,000. Indians had far more capability in their power to spend. The limit how much they could spend also closely followed. The cost of living, however, had been rising over a period of time, symbolized by the rate of inflation. But overall, I would say that the consumption had increased, except for the last, as I said, 7 years, where we reached on, I think, one of the lowest consumption figures in about 45 years. Some people do question the data, but I think the consumption has decreased. Next slide. The CPI, which quantifies the cost to a particular basket of goods for households over time, has also risen on year since 2012, as recent as September 21, when the pandemic took its toll. The index to 163.20. It's not as drastic it was in 1991 following the economic crisis, but its steady rise means that the actual extent to which Indians can spend and not regard job stability as a main priority is not as large as other developing countries, or by comparison to the developed economies of the world. So we are doing good, but we are not doing something very good in terms of being an emerging economy compared to the rest of the world. Next slide. This is how we have done so far. Next slide, please. Now, then the question of opportunities, the asymmetry in opportunities, that is access to employment and to access to jobs. Here we see between 1983 to 94, when reforms had just come through, the annual growth rate of employment was 2.04%. Whereas following the reforms from 94 to 2004, it was 0.98%. That means the growth of jobs is not taking place to the desired extent. And if we do granulate this particular data, desegregate, then we find that the jobs were created mostly in construction, finance, transport, storage, and communication. And that has actually increased the size of the cake. That has created jobs. That has given jobs to few people, but that's not enough. The primary sectors which employed and continue to employ the largest number, agriculture, handloom, textiles, mostly in the informal sector, they still languish. Many of these sectors which have grown are capital intensive. They have been capital intensive and skill intensive as well, both which were lacking. We have addressed these concerns much later, and therefore there is this lag that has happened between jobs requiring certain skills and educational level, and the education not really supplying those skills and supplying that level of competence. Next. The growth from 91 had pushed for greater employment, but was not able to create advanced jobs that I talked about. And the pandemic has only worsened this situation, because the informal workers now have rushed to the rural areas. You will find increasing demand for allocation in the NREGS, the Rural Job Guarantee Scheme, which is a self-selection scheme. It's a self-employment. It is not a employment which even the higher levels of informal sector were providing before the pandemic. So as far as employment is concerned, asymmetries in employment are concerned, it is huge and stark as of now compared to what it was in 1991. Next. So you can see if you leave aside the pandemic period, but you can see that the employment rate has not been increasing as much as to match with the growth of the economy or the size of the cake, and therefore it's the allegation of a jobless growth that has often been spoken about in the Indian context. Next. Now, if we talk about investment, in investments, the opportunity that was available, the private investment has risen significantly from around 10% to nearly 25% by 2009, and total investment rate had also risen. However, the LPG model's effect had worn off by this time. The total rate of investment as well as private investment began to decline by the turn of the next decade. So 2020-21, during the pandemic, the investment rates fell to one of the lowest level to 29.3%. And the private investment having been largely crowded out, both factors both the factors are responsible for the drop in public sector investment, which has also declined to nearly 5%. So without strong, next slide please, without strong public spending or investment, the growing middle class of the country, which dependent on it, they have struggled. And they have struggled due to its lack of efficiency in development, ultimately causing private investors to avoid investment due to a lack of confidence and uncertainty, and hence the decline of foreign investment in the country in the recent times as well. This therefore hinders investment in the economy as a whole. Actual opportunity to participate in the economy becomes difficult and doubtful. The middle class, which is supposed to participate in a much larger way, in much larger share, haven't had this opportunity so far, and this has actually dwindled to a great deal after the pandemic. Therefore, the inequity in opportunities in access to various kinds of avenues has also been affected greatly, despite the fact that we have had the kind of growth that we have been talking about, that is, the size of the cake has increased. Next slide, please. On governance asymmetry, I will just, it will be suffice to say, you can have a look at the slide. The overall governance is a huge, it's a huge discipline to talk about, but I've just picked up the aspect of corruption because that's what affects the country the most. While we have opened up, while the size of the cake has increased, the efficiency and the effectiveness of distribution of this cake by a trickle-down process depends on how good the governance is. And here, I think corruption plays a very important role. We have seen that India still ranks 86 out of 180 countries by the Transparency International Corruption Perception Index. And therefore, I think this is something which is a huge cause for concern. Next slide. This is the graphical representation, how it has moved over a period of time. Can we go to the next, please? Now, this is where the asymmetries have been most stark, despite the size of the cake increasing over the last 30 years. Before 91, the government spent no more than 4% of GDP as expenditure on education. By 2011, it had only increased to 4.05%, which basically means that the fruits of growth, the fruits of increasing the size of the cake has not really, helped in improving access to education, quality of education. I'm not getting into all those details. All I can say is that if the percentage of expenditure, the expenditure on education as a percentage of GDP is an indicator, then we haven't done too well. And therefore, the existing or pre-existing asymmetries in education that existed prior to 1991 somehow continue even now. Despite the new National Education Policy 2020, there is an unmanageable ratio of teachers to students. We haven't been even able to do 1:40. The pupils teacher ratio is 30:1, and upper primary level it is 35. We have improved a little bit, but we haven't reached anywhere near the level of a developed country. And it is definitely not commensurate with the growth that we have seen in economic terms. The economic liberalization for education has failed to see substantial improvement towards educational infrastructure in the country. Now, this is where a big cause of concern comes in, because it is not just higher education. It is also the more important thing is primary and secondary education. We have the Right to Information, the Right to Education Act. We have made changes in improving infrastructure, but definitely that has not been sufficient. It is only of late that a huge push is being given to education by transforming the education sector by bringing in huge investments. What is, however, lacking is the private investment in primary and secondary education by some kind of a cross-subsidy effort. That has not really worked. Next. As far as health is concerned, the healthcare saw same rates of GDP as expenditure, never crossing 5% from 1991 to 2021. In fact, it was 0.6% in 1991, and it is just 1.1% in 2021, the last budget. So health is, despite the pandemic, despite the actually seeing the impact the pandemic had, and the way our primary health services, or even to some extent the tertiary health services, were overwhelmed by the pandemic, and the number of cases that came in cities like Delhi, the expenditure on health has been severely lacking despite our growth in economy. In the 1980s, the infant mortality rate since 1980s, it has declined by 30%. The rate has only declined by 12.5% in 1990. It has declined, but it is nowhere near the best. In fact, the latest report, in one of the reports, it says that while the asymmetries are so huge between geographies, between the states, that Kerala currently matches some of the best figures in the United States, and Madhya Pradesh, some of the states in some of the countries in Sub-Saharan Africa. So the asymmetries in health, access to health, as well as quality of health, has been enormous. Despite the national health policies of 2017, the pandemic often saw hospitals with unbearable loads of patients to fewer doctors, and I spoke about this, and this has to change. The health infrastructure at all levels, both for primary care, for tertiary care, for super specialty care, in every aspect, the health infrastructure has suffered. The people who are rich, the richer, they are able to afford a better healthcare services, and people who are poorer are not able to afford the kind of health services that should be available to them because of the growth. In fact, the out-of-pocket expenses that most Indians have to spend, that is 2/3 of India and rural India, is close to 60%. Despite, again, the Prime Minister's, the overall health insurance scheme, the matter hasn't really improved, because whatever said and done, the insurance or an assurance scheme doesn't guarantee improvement in the health infrastructure per se. And that health infrastructure has to increase both through public investment as well as private investment. And I think the best model for that would have been a PPP model. Next. This is the health spending in graphical terms. I've spoken about it. Can you go to the next slide, please? As far as agriculture is concerned, the actual export of agricultural products has increased from 3.3% in the 80s to 8.1% in the 90s. Agro-processing has increased. The export basket actually had a major diversification. It stands 17.3%. We have had all those revolutions, so it has brought in food security. There is no doubt about it since 1991. But the asymmetries, the next slide, is that the next slide, please. The constant focus on industrialization and urbanization economy has seen a dip in agricultural sector. The essence of this particular slide is the fact that we have seen agricultural growth, but the contribution of agriculture to the GDP, the contribution of agriculture to the economy has been dwindling. That is because of a lack of reforms. The reforms are not really only in terms of changing the laws and changing the regulations, but it is actually increasing making agriculture a profitable proposition. And making agriculture a profitable proposition by subsidies alone cannot be the mode. And that is what we have not changed in the last 30 years. If we have to get private investment into the agricultural sector, then we have to think something different. And that is where the agriculturist feels that there is no point investing or no point investing in agriculture, no point being in the business of agriculture, and the migration to low-skilled jobs in urban areas has increased. Now, this is one asymmetry growth that one has to contend with very quickly. Attempts are being made, but these attempts have to be taking the farmers into confidence, farmers into a role where they feel that it is actually a profitable proposition like industry or like any other business. Next.
Sorry to interrupt. We have exactly 8 minutes left. Thank you.
Yes, sure. Next. Next, please. Yeah. Now, as far as we had these huge issues relating to food. Now, food is not a problem in terms of destitution. The people who access to food has improved remarkably well. The distribution networks have worked very well. The use of technology to a limited extent has also improved. The irrigation has actually added the impetus that was required to produce food. The productivity has increased, but nowhere near some of the better countries in Southeast Asia itself. What has, however, continued is undernourishment. Despite the food, we still continue to have undernourishment within our population, and that's something which is an impact, which is the asymmetric impact of the growth. The distribution which has been done amongst the people, somehow it doesn't reach the people who it is actually supposed to be targeted to. There are areas where undernourishment is as high as sub-Saharan Africa. And there are areas, there are geographies where there is, of course, very low level of undernourishment. Now, these are some of these asymmetries which one has to contend with despite the economic growth that one has seen. Next. So the undernourished population between 2002 to 2018 has decreased substantially as the percentage of population who are undernourished, but it is still very high, compared to some of the other countries. In fact, it is very high compared to countries like Pakistan itself and Bangladesh, Indonesia, Malaysia. Next slide. So the food asymmetry has resulted in something that we score very low in the global hunger index, and it has been going down. Some people question the veracity of these figures, but we commensurate with the economic growth that has taken place, we shouldn't have been having this figure. We should have been, we can say that we shouldn't have been our scores should have been 40 or 45 or 50 and shouldn't have been as low as 27.5 because we have all these schemes available. But the problem is that the stunting, that is children who are low in weight or height, they continue because of food shortages. I talked about the undernourishment. The pandemic has actually opened up this can quite largely, and it is suspected that this is going to increase much more post-pandemic.
If you interrupt again, Dr. Patnaik, we have 5 minutes left.
Yes, and then the last thing that I wanted to talk about is the gender asymmetry. Now, while the growth has impacted the population, PPP has increased, per capita has increased, it has not evenly spread between the genders. The statistics is here, but I'll go straight to the labor market to say can I have to go to the next slides, please? I'll spend this little more time on that. Next, please. Next. Yeah. So the labor force participation took off, but it was a relative national statistics. The International Labour Organization is predicted by the time in 2020, the total labor force participation rate was 46.29%. The labor force participation amongst the male and the female, which is also reflective of the gender asymmetry, is also quite stark. In fact, India's female force labor participation is one of the lowest amongst the Southeast Asian countries. So despite the economic growth, this is something which has remained, and this asymmetry seems to be increasing. And therefore, the inequity, the gender inequity is increasing. Next. So can I come to the conclusion? So so as we can see that while can you go to the slide? Next slide. Next, please. Yeah. So despite the remarkable progress that we have done using the LPG model, the economic regression we have taken care of economic regression, but the regression that has happened in several other fronts, which affect society, which affect the way the society develops and the way the wealth is distributed, the way the cake gets distributed has been very uneven, and that continues to be a cause of concern. Many governance policies, many public policies designed to address this seem to have not been implemented to the extent possible, because even after 30 years, we are grappling with some of those issues. So where is the problem? The problem could be in the next slide, which the solution could be in the next slide. Can I have the next slide? I have spoken about this in Parliament all the time, that it is time to kill the GDP. And that's what Stiglitz says. The world is facing three existential crises. One is, of course, the crisis of inequality crisis, the climate crisis. I didn't talk about sustainability. I didn't talk about this thing. We are doing quite well, I can say in one sentence, but the world is not doing. And this impact will also be faced by countries like India. And then the most important thing is a crisis of democracy. It has been proven beyond doubt that democracies have done much better in economic growth compared to autocracies or despots, statistically as well. However, these are three concerns which Stiglitz says, and therefore he says that let us kill GDP and look at a new metric. And that metric could be, someone can argue that it could be the SDG, it could be the gross national happiness that Bhutan does, it could be something else. But these fault lines of inequality are going to create a problem despite economic growth or growth in the GDP. And the time is now to reset our economy, given the fact that the pandemic has really brought open some of those fault lines wide open, and therefore we could actually move ahead, reforming and looking at these issues much more closely. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Patnaik. Amlan, over to you.
Thank you. So that was a fascinating talk. I think we have time for just about one question. So there are so many things to ask, basically, because the presentation was covered so many aspects and it was extremely thought-provoking. One of the things that I wanted to ask you, and you highlighted this towards the end, the three different crises that you talked about. One is climate, the next one is inequality. So all these crises are also interrelated. So I just wanted to have your opinion about India today seems to be taking climate seriously, at least that's what we hear from the Prime Minister as well. So, but in any sort of change, there are always winners and losers. And as you have pointed out, things have gone really bad in terms of inequality. So what can we expect in terms of if we are able to make this transition? Is the blow going to fall disproportionately on the sections that have already suffered a lot, and how can we, or what would be your take on this, basically?
Very good question, and in fact, this is something which is very thought provoking because you see, climate is one such thing where the poor, the people who are mostly living in the rural areas, are probably going to have the least impact because culturally, traditionally, historically, it is these people who have had a kind of symbiotic relationship with nature and environment, and they survived in this manner. So when we are moving towards a net zero, and we're saying that we will have to bring in non-fossil based systems into place and have systems which do not generate the kind of carbon emissions and whatever these aspects. It is actually, I think, that's my opinion, that it is the best model for growth because it is not net zero now, it will be net positive. Because the rural areas, the people who have been living with nature, they would be actually having no difference in their life if the education, health, and the basic services are provided to them in a manner in which emission is less. So the adjustment with this particular regime of a net zero would be actually less problematic for rural areas. It will be the most problematic for people who are in the urban areas, who are spending more, who are the rich. So I have a feeling that if India adopts this model, it will be actually net positive. Net zero would be net positive.
Thank you so much, Dr. Patnaik. Unfortunately, we have completely run out of time. Otherwise, we could have had a much more engaging discussion here. So let me end by thanking you once again